Hi, I'm Allison Hare, and welcome to Little Left of Center, the podcast that interviews culture changers that are reshaping our world and breaking new ground. Oh, that was the very first episode. Did you hear how overmodulated I am? It was so loud, and I was so slow and deliberate. Let's get into it. Welcome to the show. What if the problem isn't you? What if you're in the wrong room? My suspicion? You're not broken and you don't need to be fixed. You've outgrown where you are. Let's get more space and freedom to redesign the life you deserve. Welcome to the Reinvention Room. I'm Allison Hare, podcast launch strategist for ambitious leaders, and we are rethinking everything we've been taught. Part pop culture, part real talk, and all smarter ways to live life on your own terms. May 14th, 2019, this podcast aired its very first episode. And, 6 years is a long time to stick with anything, especially something as public and personal as a podcast. And this show has been through a lot of identity crises, name changes, format experiments. I've experimented with everything. And more than one moment where I thought, should I just shut this thing down? What am I even doing? But I didn't, and I've learned a lot along the way. And in today's episode, we're going to celebrate a bunch too. And I'm sharing some stories I've never told anywhere about the good, the messy, and the stuff I got totally wrong. So if you've got a podcast or you're thinking about starting one, this will give you some real insight into what it takes to actually make it last and why influence isn't always loud or flashy. So I'm going to start with some of the highlights before I drop the bomb on the bad stuff and the behind the scenes. And so I started to compile a bunch of numbers. Like this is the 253rd episode. And what you may not know is that I, a few years ago, ran an entirely separate podcast. It was called The Podcaster's Journey. And it was a podcast about podcasting for podcasters. It couldn't be more meta. But I got to over 30 episodes, interviewed some really notable people, and just ran out of steam. But I'm approaching 300 published episodes altogether, almost 1 million downloads, countless notable game-changing guests. I've interviewed people like Seth Godin, and Mariel Hemingway, not people such as Seth Godin, Mariel Hemingway, Jesse Itzler, so many scientists and authors and journalists and professors and just people doing incredible things in the world. There've been so many invaluable connections and relationships built. There is a power of influence that happens when you have a platform like a podcast. And if you don't know, I have a degree in broadcasting. My dream was always to be on the radio. And I'll back up for a second just so you have a little bit of context if you don't know. But I was raised by a stay-at-home mom of 6 kids. And she told me and my sisters, she would beat it into our heads. Allison, never rely on a man to make money. Always make your own. So a seed was planted, right? And so when I got to college and discovered there was a radio station and I took a voice and diction class, and when I took the class, it felt like all the lights in my body turned on. I knew for the first time ever that my gift was my voice. But I don't know. And the question has always been, I'm 50 years old now. The question has always been, if my gift is my voice, how do I use it as a force for good? What do I say? And so when I graduated college, I had sent a demo tape with like 5 pies of pizza to the radio station with my demo and a resume on top, and they laughed and thought it was clever. But my demo was a disaster, and it was like, no, thank you. And I ended up in all points of my career always picking the money. I I I ended up going into marketing and then sales, and spent 25 years almost in corporate sales. And every single turn when I had an opportunity to use my voice, it was always like this little secret, this little thing I had on the shelf. It was never out front, right? So that probably sets the stage a little bit of the power of influence. And, when I started this podcast, um, man, it was interesting because when I started, I was seeking. And I remember, man, why the podcast? I remember listening to the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. You remember that before he was named a Supreme Court justice? He was embroiled in a lot of controversy, and Christine Blasey Ford was testifying about her experience being attacked by him. And around that time, Me Too was really coming into the forefront. And I remember at this time, I don't know what it was about. Like, I was never politically minded. I never even gave an F, and then Trump got in office, and then everybody gave an F. And for me, I felt like this Brett Kavanaugh thing just had me undone. I didn't know why it so deeply impacted and upset me. It just did, and I would have so many people that I know and love that were on Facebook, on Instagram, whatever, sharing their Me Too story, and every night I would cry myself to sleep. I just couldn't bear how much pain so many people were in as they were coming forth with their truth. And at the time, there were a bunch of things that were going on in my life personally where I was coming face to face with the education system and deep seated racism and systemic oppression that was happening in our school systems, because I was volunteering at an inner city school. And I did it for like 6 years where I would work with the students, and I was on the board. I was an academic mentor for them. And I just started to see all of this stuff. I also came face to face with, a really troubled medical system, especially with my own birth stories, that one was like devastating and essentially took my voice away. And the other one was miraculous and gave my voice back. And having access to this medical system and seeing how many things were broken in our world. And to me, I felt like there has to be something that I'm learning this all in real time, that if people like me knew what was happening, if we discovered this together, then we could, is there a way for us to get together and create change? And really, that was kind of the genesis of the podcast. But even before that, I knew that I felt like, I don't know, like posting on social media, my snarky comments, and that was really my only outlet of expression, but it wasn't enough. And it's all in the void. You're either arguing with somebody or you're in an echo chamber, and neither of them are productive. And I just thought that there was more to be had. In the meantime, I got a promotional email about a podcast launch course, and I didn't even look at the price. It was from somebody that I trusted. I didn't look at the price. I just said yes. I had no idea what I was going to talk about at all. I just figured I would figure it out. I didn't really know a lot about podcasting at all. And when I started, like, this podcast was never a political podcast, but it was born of the political frustration and feeling like there's so much out there that needs to be changed, that if people knew, if people understood in context, that was always the heart and soul of this podcast. And when I launched on May 14th, 2019, my name of this podcast was Little Left of Center. So I'm kind of laughing because little left of center, most people, what do you think? You think about politically, right? But that was not it at all. I didn't even understand that that was a political reference. But my mother always said that the way I thought was always a little left of center. Everything I did was a little left of center. It wasn't wild and out there, but it wasn't quite mainstream either. And so I thought, like this is kind of a fresh, new status quo breaking twist. And it was always how to change culture, right? It has always been about that. And that has never changed. And so the podcast has had 5 different names. So it went from little left of center. Once I realized that it was, I had to explain it every single time of like, hey, what's your podcast? Well, and I'd put my hand up, right? If you're watching me on video, I'd put my hand on and say, it's not a political podcast. Here's what it really is about. It doesn't work, right? When you have to explain what it is when you are somebody that is not well known. So it was little left of center. I changed it to Bright This Way, which I don't know. Clear is always better than clever, right? And I've actually had my LLC's name now is Bright This Way. I do think it's a cute name, but it didn't really get the heart of what we do here in this show. Bright This Way sounded like an inspirational podcast, and that wasn't really what this was about either. So then I changed it to Culture Changers at the advice of somebody I really, really trust. And he's like, call it what it is. Call it what it is. Call it what it's about. But the challenge with Culture Changers is nobody's really Googling, how do I become a culture changer? It wasn't quite on the mark. Then I changed it to late learner because I'm like, we're curious, we're learning together, we're figuring it out. But, that was still too passive. So at the beginning of this year, we changed it again, which is very on brand, to Reinvention Room, which, makes perfect sense, right? So, and what had happened, I was thinking about this too, is about maybe 6 months into my journey, 6, 7 months into my journey as a podcaster. I had remembered this. I've never shared this story. And in fact, it just came back to me where the heart of the podcast coaching came from. And there's a woman named Kim Shaper. Kim Shaper was my guest. She was like maybe guest 4 or 5 that I've ever had on this show. And she was magnificent. She's an incredible fitness and wellness and nutrition and really like kind of hormone balancing for women over 40, um, expert in the field. But she had such an incredible story around disordered eating and eating disorders. And she was anorexic and she was obese and she was all of these things. And she was a, high level athlete and had such a great story. But she had built this massive platform on social media. And so I kept asking her about it. And I kept asking her about like, how do I get out of corporate America? How do I get like people to listen to my show? How do I make this into a business? And so at the time, she invited me and a couple of other people to her home to do a workshop. And she kept asking, like, what do people ask you about podcasts? What do you love learning about podcasts? What do you love talking about podcasts? What can you teach better than anything else? Podcasts. And it just kept coming up again and again and again. And I remember we sat in her living room and she had a whiteboard. And on the whiteboard, we came up with a name, Press Play Podcast, which became the name of my very first coaching cohort and coaching program that I launched in November of 2019. And God, it's so wild that that was the genesis of all that. And my very first cohort is where Brian Green was in, and Brian Green has launched the podcast, The Commercial Break, which is currently ranked number one in comedy improv on Apple and Spotify podcasts. Brian and I have been friends for like, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years. And he kind of answered the call to, hey, is anyone interested in podcasts on Facebook? And a bunch of people had said yes. And I started this program and just kind of built it from scratch and helped a lot of people get these incredibly uh, impactful shows that made a huge difference. So as a podcast coach, and this is kind of like the parallel track to my actual podcast. But as a podcast coach, I've been teaching people how to launch podcasts undercover for 6 years, kind of on and off. Just I would help people as they would come across and they would continuously come across. And it's had a lot of different iterations. But I've supported creators in dozens of shows, and, these shows have generated over 50 million downloads. They've landed major sponsorships and propelled careers. Some are full time as podcasters. It's just been, just amazing to be able to do this. And I started thinking about all the podcast conferences that I went to. And in 2019, I went to my very first podcast conference. I don't even think they have it anymore, but it was She Podcast, and it was the inaugural all female. And this was before, gender and pronouns had kind of hit mainstream, but it was called She Podcast, and it was all women, and it was in Atlanta. And I was like, man, it's expensive. I don't know if I should go. And at the very last minute, I went, and it was like, whew, it was so magnificent. I remember meeting Erica Mandy from The Newsworthy, is a very big podcast. I've since had her on my show as well. And Marriage and Martinis, I can't remember her name, but I saw them speak, and it was just really wonderful. And the crazy thing about podcast conferences is that everyone can talk, like there's no weird conversations. There's no, I remember going on an escalator, and I just turned to the person next to me. I didn't know anybody at this, and said, hey, do you want to go to lunch? And she's like, yeah, let's do it. It was just such a really interesting kind of safe space. As all female, nobody is trying to get anything from you. They're all eager to kind of connect and meet with you and learn about you. They're all curious. It was such a beautiful thing. But I've been to lots and lots of podcast conferences since, and I have an interesting perspective on podcast conferences. Podfest is one of the biggest podcast conferences in the world. It is led by Chris Kremitzos, who, by all accounts, is one of the most well-respected, personable, just he is a gift to the podcast world. And he has put these on all over the world and goes on tours. And he's just incredibly generous, incredible leader and community builder. And so I've been to Podfest. Podcast Movement is probably the biggest podcast conference that I've been. And through Podcast Movement, I've met Mark Cuban. I've gone to a private dinner with him. John Lee Dumas, Jordan Harbinger. These are big people in the podcast space. I've seen so many incredible, magnificent, notable, well-known people. Of course, I'm forgetting all of their names. Audie Cornish. I remember seeing her speak, and just, I don't know, just change makers. These are the taste makers of podcasting, and they are furthering the conversation. But I had a really interesting discovery that I found through the podcast conferences. The first one I went to was magic, and I was a brand new podcaster. You learn so much, and there's so much available to you. There's so many podcast equipment and softwares and ways to make it easier, ways to monetize. And back then, a lot of the goal was to monetize your podcast and really the top way to monetize your podcast is to get advertisers, ads, and affiliates. And generally speaking, you need a lot. You need a lot of downloads for that. It is not an overnight thing. When you think of Joe Rogan and um, Tim Ferriss and Mark Maron and these huge podcasters that have been around forever, they've been around forever since the beginning. Lewis Howes, when he started his podcast, I think it was like 15 years ago, it was still kind of little fledgling thing that not a lot of people listened to. But what I found is that I would keep going back to these podcast conferences, and my show wasn't brand new, but it was nowhere near these massive, huge podcasts. It was like the independent creator. And I felt like complete shit walking away from those. And I a lot has changed. Like I've changed, like the catalyst for changing my name of the podcast had come from those, like big changes happened through that. But I started to realize I feel like complete shit that I'm not big enough to be looked at by other, I don't know, media platforms or advertisers that I would want to. And everyone is trying to figure out, how do I get more listeners? Of course, every person wants to get more listeners. Every person. It never goes away. And I remember coming home from the last podcast movement that I went to, and it was really kind of my brother, actually, because I wasn't going to go because I had left my corporate job. I had zero income and I wanted to go all in on my podcast. This was 3 years ago. And my brother is like, hey, are you going to podcast movement in Dallas or wherever it was? And I was like, no, there's just no way that I can afford it. He's like, this is your career. I'd like to pay for you to go. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, I believe in you. I want you to go. And I went and met incredible people, but everything I wanted was so aspirational that it made me want to quit and change everything. It made me want to quit and change everything. And that was the thing. Like, I didn't want to quit. I just didn't know how to make it work. I didn't know how to speed it up. I didn't know, like the measure of success was downloads, and that's it. And I couldn't figure out how to find my voice. Now, like it, I didn't know how to find my voice. And again, at the time, I think it was culture changers back then. So I'm like, all right, fine. I'm going to change my name. But how do I shift this? I'm not selling anything. I don't have a business. I just want people to listen. And so one of the big lessons that I learned that I'll talk about later, because I'm going to go through, let's talk about the lows and let's talk about the lessons that I learned. So one of those lessons was you got to have a destination point. You got to have a reason for people to tune in. Not that they're going to be inspired. It's too broad. You need something a little more specific. So I'll rewind again because this has gone through some iterations. I remember in 2020 was the rise of Clubhouse. So January 6th happens and Clubhouse goes crazy, crazy. 2020, like there's so much unrest. There's so much racial unrest with George Floyd, and people are looking for an outlet and groups to form to help create change, help create community. Do you remember Clubhouse? It was like this audio. You can open up a room and invite people in and talk about whatever you wanted to talk about. So it would have these topics. And it was like an instant authority builder. So me and Brian Green is the host of the Commercial Break. We decided to host these rooms in Clubhouse. And we would host these podcast specific rooms where people would come in. We would just do an open Q&A. It was like an instant authority builder. So we started like coaching people on it. And we did something called the Weekend Podcaster. And this was kind of a cool concept where we took my program that at first it started at 6 weeks. Now it's 12 weeks. But we took this program and we condensed it to happen over the weekend. So theoretically, you could come, and we did this several times with lots of podcasters, but you would come in on a Friday and you could have nothing. You could have maybe a vague idea, and we would workshop with you over the whole weekend. And on Sunday evening, you would have a fully produced podcast strategy. You would have cover art, you'd have your first episode ready to go, you'd have your trailer, all of it would be done. And we had a team that was working with us to do this. It was so interesting how much the Clubhouse thing had introduced me to people, not only in the podcast world, because we would invite podcast leaders into our Clubhouse space. And I remember when Elon Musk came in, not to our podcast space, but there was so much going on, like these people that were considered pretty big in the space, and they were getting on Clubhouse. So there was just this groundswell. And then all of a sudden it took like a hard right turn where it was a lot of conspiracy theorists, and I haven't checked in on it, but I remember Grant Cardone coming in, and I knew that who Grant Cardone was, like this kind of in your face wealth, like just audacious, filthy wealth, just flaunting of it all. And then he would talk about like QAnon and all this stuff, and I'm like, I am out. this is not this is not where I want to be. And it just got weird. And so everyone got off of Clubhouse. And at the time, I was building this podcast, and I ended up asking Seth Godin to be on my podcast, which was amazing about Seth Godin. Seth Godin is one of the foremost, I would say, convention breaking, well respected thought leaders in the world. So he is a best selling author, I think something like 20 times over, number one New York Times best selling author, and just, he's amazing. I've gotten he writes a blog every single day, every single day, has not missed holidays, whatever, for I think 15, 20 years. And I open and read every single one. I've taken his programs. I am a student of his work. And one day I got up the gumption and emailed him and said, I'm such a fan of your work. I've been in through your programs. And at this moment, because it was right around the George Floyd stuff, I feel like your voice is needed more than ever. Would you be a guest on my podcast? He responded back like within 30 minutes and said, I would love to. And I remember I was about to go into dance class or something. And I remember dropping to my knees and crying and say, I can't believe one of my idols. He was like at the top of my list for who I would want to interview, because his voice is that consequential, and his influence is so powerful. I remember meeting, I've got to interview all these amazing people. And I remember meeting Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, in her kitchen when I interviewed her husband, Jesse Itzler, who is a magnificent human and like the most unconventional ever. And who he is online, if you don't follow him, follow Jesse Itzler. He's such a good hang and such a good follow. He is who he is to his core. I've spent a lot of time with him. And honestly, through Jesse, I've met Rich Roll, who is somebody I really deeply respect in the podcast space. I discovered and I started doing endurance challenges. And even me finding dance was through Jesse Itzler, through my connection with him. And my life literally has changed because of some of the people that are on my show and the conversations that we've had and the relationships that we've built. And, there is a little bit of something I want to teach you about because there's a belief, um, a common belief that is wrong that you need big names to grow your show. And the truth is, a big celebrity name will not grow your show. Maybe it'll grow an episode, that episode, unless all of your episodes have celebrities that are notable, but they are not what grows your show at all. And I want to talk about the Cindy Robinson phenomenon. So if you have been listening to me for a while, there is a woman that I know. Her name is Cindy Robinson. Cindy Robinson back then was unknown. She had virtually no following at all. And to be honest, she hates social media. She does not want to be the center of attention. It's just not her thing at all. And when I first started the podcast, I got an email from Cindy. I didn't know who she was. And she was saying how much she loved my show and that it was so meaningful to her and that she loved it. And maybe, I don't know, she was just, kind of, I love getting notes like this. It really keeps me going when you hear, like I always say, my love language is I was listening to your podcast and dot, dot, dot. That is my love language. So I love hearing from you. And Cindy just, emailed me out of the blue. And Cindy, back then, and I'll say back then because she is not that way, but she was somebody that was just deeply, um, I don't know if it's self-sabotaging, but she was just, kind of led with her insecurities. Like, I don't know why people would want to hear dumb old me. And she, it was self-deprecating, very self-deprecating. But she's magnificently brilliant. And I started to get to know her, and she was doing these incredible things for kids in the Atlanta area. And I invited her on my show, and we have started a partnership and a friendship that I just have nothing but respect for Cindy. And what's interesting about Cindy is she sits around and reads medical books and she synthesizes the information in a way that only her brain, it seems, can put together. But what is interesting about her, she's been on my show probably 12 or 13 times with all different topics. And every time she comes on my show, they are the biggest, they're the ones I hear the most about. They're the ones that I have people calling me crying, saying, thank you for having her on. It's helping. Her shows are the ones where I have the biggest downloads, and nobody knows who she was. Nobody knows. But it was so freaking valuable. And what I love about her is that everything she does is unconventional, but so deeply backed by science and research, but not the research that's public facing that may stand to gain from financial gain. These are like the nerds that are underground because they are studying. They aren't distracted trying to become some shiny object or get accolades or try and get rich or well known. They are like doing the work. And those are the people she's tapping into, kind of synthesizing this information. And what's crazy about it is that she is the epitome of what this show is about. She is always challenging conventional wisdom, but once explained in her very particular, specific way, which is so nurturing and affirming and so thoughtful and smart. And once she explains it, it makes perfect sense. And even more profoundly, it worked. And honestly, I can promise you, the son that I have now, who is 12, my son Danny, if it were not for Cindy Robinson, he would not be in the place that he is now as a happy, healthy, confident, strong human, because I would have beat out any bit of his sensitivity, not beat on physically, right? But I would have maybe taken a page out of the book that I know of, like, boys don't cry, men don't do this, suck it up. But my son is also highly sensitive. And I wouldn't have known that without Cindy. And there are just countless examples of that. And so Cindy has not, as a sidebar, some people wonder, where is Cindy? Cindy is writing a book and she's writing a second memoir. She wrote her first memoir. It's called Bright Girl Lacks Focus. And somehow this little self-published book that had no fanfare, no anything. She does things by her own rule, is starting to take off and go viral on its own. And she took a year off of social media completely. And she's like, I hate it. This sucks. Why am I posting for trolls? And she got off for a year. And in that year, she wrote that memoir, Bright Girl Lacks Focus. And when she came back, she started doing this thing where she would just post and ghost. And she would do these funny kind of ADHD neurodivergent memes. And she's got over 100,000 followers now. And she does not want to monetize it. She's not selling anything. It is not her deal at all to be famous. It just took off. She just posts and goes. She does not give a fuck about how many followers she has, but she does want to serve her community. And in this process, she found out that she was late diagnosed on the spectrum of autism. And she's like, holy shit, holy shit. And that's why she is writing her second memoir. So fingers crossed. She has been heads down in that. And I am hoping that as she goes to release this, that she'll come back on, the door is always open to her. But that is a little bit of the Cindy Robinson phenomenon. But, she has been on the show, everything from teens and screens, hating to play with your kids, which is something I hate. I'm not very good at play. Parenting teenagers, false prophets, ADHD, neurodiversity, being late diagnosed. We've talked about so many different interesting, fantastic topics. So if you want, you can just go to the search button and put Cindy Robinson Reinvention Room and take your pick. But yeah, I do want to talk about some of the other stories behind this podcast. And one of the big ones was when I did leave corporate America. And before I left, this podcast has truly been there for me as much as I have been there for you. And when I think about the people that I've been able to connect with and the kind of connections and conversations that have happened as a result of this show, it's such an honor and such a gift for me. And I remember when I was in corporate America and I would sit at this desk and I remember I would hold this stone. So I'm holding up an obsidian stone. It's a black, this one I think is tumbled, so it's polished. This stone, obsidian, is supposed to mean protection. And at the time, I was working for a really toxic boss, somebody that was mercurial, humiliating to everyone around him. You didn't know what kind of person you were going to get. He just was awful. And I remember sitting at this desk and feeling everything tense up, just the constriction of working. And it was putting on the mask of all right, I'm going to be corporate Allison and I'm going to try and buckle down. And I remember my shoulders would just be, I would wear them like earrings. And I would just look at the clock and say, okay, it's 9:43. I just need to make it to 10. I just have 17 more minutes. And I would just do these mental countdowns of when can I exhale? But in between all of those, doing this podcast, I would, I had my corporate job. I would get up at 5 a.m. And so I would record podcast episodes sometimes during lunch. Sometimes I would do it in the evenings. Most of the time, that's when I would do them. I would edit them on the weekends, usually Saturday mornings, and that was it. I would do my homework and research for whatever guest I have. I would always do them on Tuesdays because Tuesday nights was when my son had karate. So while he was at karate, I would research and write up my questions and be ready for the interview of whenever it would happen. And so it just was kind of working like clockwork. And at the same time, I would have these unbelievable conversations. And I remember Chris Shembra. Chris Shembra is this really fascinating guest of mine. He's been on my show 3 times, and I'll tell you the topics and you're going to be like, "Holy shit." He was on my podcast the first time because he was it was called the a new twist on gratitude. He's known as the gratitude guru, has a really interesting and incredible career, supporting a lot of people and executives and corporations, the biggest corporations that you've ever heard of. He works with and supports. The second time he came on was to talk about BDSM because that is part of his life and his lifestyle as well. And so that was holy shit fascinating. And just to give you a taste, he got into character while I was interviewing him, and it was on video, but oh, I was like beside, like, it's not something I really know a lot about. So it was just completely from a place of curiosity, of understanding the lifestyle and what it meant. And the third time he came on because he had done ketamine therapy as well. But the first time he came on, and this was the difference, like when I was wanting to leave corporate America, I felt this, man. I remember him asking, I always would ask, or I would ask often my guests, what do you know that you wish other people could know? And most people would have their learning, their wisdom, their nugget of wisdom, but not Chris. When I asked him, Chris, what do you know that you wish other people could know? And he didn't skip a beat. And he said, me. And I immediately started tearing up. And I was like, what do you mean, you? And he said, I wish people knew me. And he's like, why are you getting emotional? And I remember thinking, I remember saying, like, I have this podcast and I wish somebody would listen. you know, I wish people could know who I am. And I felt that so deeply and profoundly. And I remember how like freeing and liberating it felt to have these meaningful exchanges. And that was, during the pandemic, I wasn't doing as many in-person interviews. Most of my interviews were people that were in person. I would record them in my husband's office downstairs, which we converted into a studio, and it was really great. I love the in-person in-person podcast, just easier to connect that way. But man, it was like when I would get on this mic and record, it felt expansive. Or I would sit at the same desk and feel constricted. It was like a full yes in my body on the mic and a full no in my body for the corporate life that I was living. And, obviously working for a toxic boss like that. I've generally had really incredible bosses, and there were some duds along the way and some that really were life-changing, but not in the way that you would want, right? And that was definitely what was going on. It was like something has to change. And when I left corporate, I was like, I got to go all in on the podcast. And so when I think about the lows of this show, there've been a lot. There've been a lot of them. And I think one of them is like focusing on the downloads, just focusing on the downloads of, man, I'm not growing. I'm not growing at the rate I've wanted to go on. And really, the focusing, I always tell my clients, my podcast coaching clients, don't look at the downloads for a year. Just don't. I would much rather you focus on engagement and relationship building, because the podcast is a high value networking tool, as evidenced by the stories that I'm sharing with you. But it is such an incredible way to build relationships with people that you would have absolutely no access to otherwise, and have really meaningful, deep conversations. So focusing on the downloads, I definitely got into that, and I have a different relationship with it now. And again, for me, it's all about engagement. And I also feel like there are three ways to make money, three primary ways to make money with a podcast. The first way is through ads and affiliates. But generally speaking, you need to have at least, the very, very, very least, 10,000 downloads per episode. Um, if you want to make a living at podcasting and only do it by ads and affiliates, like having Tide or AG1 or whatever it is kind of advertised on your show, you have to have at least 100,000 to actually make something substantial. The average podcast has 400 downloads. Average. Average. So that is one way. The second way is through brand sponsorships. Let's say you've got a podcast where maybe you are talking about, maybe you're playing piano for dogs, calming, soothing piano for your pets. Maybe you are doing some type of audio show that has some kind of niche. It's much easier to get sponsors when you have a really well-defined audience. And, that's kind of the other thing too, is a sidebar from a teaching moment, is that you don't want to message everyone. Everyone is not your listener. And so kind of identifying who you want listening or who's going to get the most benefit, you'll attract other people that don't fit on that category. But that's when people realize you're talking to them. And I think for me, like I was talking about culture changers that have amazing people on, but there was no real direction with my podcast. I was just podcasting what I wanted and hoping people got it. I was trying to monetize in all the wrong ways. And, like the second way is through brand sponsorships. The third way is I'm all over the place, aren't I? The third way is through your own business. You are your best sponsor. It is the easiest way, right? Where you are your best advertiser. And so, whatever your business is, your line of business, give them an opportunity to work with you on your show. But yeah, there are three primary ways to do it. And so, I had tried to monetize in so many different ways. I have advertised on other platforms. I have done host read ads. I have had advertisers kind of litter all over my show, and it sucked. It was taking away from it, and I would only be getting paid pennies on it. It's not the biggest payday unless you have a massive following. And so I tried a lot of different things, and then I just scaled it all back and said, nope, I'm going to be the advertiser for now. And just, I want to only have like really quality stuff. I've hired so many podcast coaches over the years. Some were so helpful and pivotal, and some were so fucking bad and deeply disappointing, which also is why I am so, so profoundly committed to making sure that people work with me have an incredible experience. I have them, authorize an agreement around expectations. I send out a PDF of like, how do you get the most out of working with us? So the expectations are so clear, but I always want to make sure I am over delivering what it is that you need, because I have spent so much money on people that talked a big game. And it's really disappointing of somebody that, has done this. And honestly, the reason why it has been on the back burner for so long, or it has been kind of under the radar for so long, is because there were a lot of chumps out there that I didn't want to be associated with. And that part is hard, like I had one, remember I had this one podcast coach, and he hadn't even listened to my show. Like, I paid him all this money. He hadn't even listened to my show, but was disseminating this like, arbitrary formula that didn't feel like me, but I would do it anyway because I'm like, oh, okay, it's something new. And he didn't even listen to my fucking show. Like, how could I pay you thousands of dollars and you're not even going to like listen? And then when he finally did, he's like, you're really good. And I'm like, fuck you. You know what I mean? Help me here. But it took me off track. And I think, and that's something that I always tell the people that I work with. If from a podcast perspective, I'm like, hey, I have got really strong opinions, and I'm going to have strong opinions about your show. Always default to your intuition, always over the voice of me. You will always know better. And I've seen that again and again and again, where you can put together and have a track, but if it is not in alignment with them, it's either not going to work or they're not going to do it. And that isn't helpful for either of us, And so I want it to be, I want you to always default to your intuition. So yeah, it would take me off track. I had another one. This was more recent. This was a real big gut punch, and I'm still pissed about it. This guy talked a big game about what he could do, and he had a really impressive resume and somebody that I knew and had a lot of respect for, but he kind of also took it in a different direction that didn't feel right to me. And he was really excited about it. And, like we had this a lot of time, and he went so far off the track and we ran out of time. And he's like, we're going to do this again. I'm going to finish. I'm going to make sure that you get everything you need. And he never did. He never did. He never fulfilled on his promise. He's somebody that is kind of in my circles. And it drives me nuts when people um, give this medium such a bad name and, don't deliver on their promises. And that was really a bummer. And it really changed a lot for me too. I guess in the grand scheme of things, I ended up um, taking a weekend going down to Serenbe, which is this amazing community south of Atlanta, by myself, and just locked myself in a room and just did it all myself, just tried to figure it out. I wanted to kind of leverage his brain, and it sucked. It sucked. And I was mad. I was really, really angry about it. And, it's just bad business, and I make sure that that isn't that way. So there've been a lot of lows. I think some of the lessons is having no direction. If you have a GPS is a powerful function, but unless you put a destination point in, it's useless. The same thing goes with your show. What is the direction of your show? I think for me, overproduction has been a big lesson for me, meaning, so I'll give you an example. I'm recording this episode. One of my crutches that drives me bananas is how much I say, you know, you know, you know. And there are times when I've edited my show and I would go through meticulously and edit out every pause that might be a little too long, or like, or where I stumble over my words. And sometimes I'll ask compound questions, which isn't the greatest thing to do as an interviewer. So I would cut it, like I'd be yelling at myself, like, get to the point, right? And we get so critical on ourselves about how we're coming across. And I am no exception. And I have a bad case of perfectionism. And what would happen is I would spend hours just polishing up a 30-minute interview where normally, like, I could get it all done, like everything packaged, edited in an hour. but I was going through where I was like, I can't have it too long. I can't have it where people are going to get bored. I don't want it where I sound like an idiot, where I don't sound like I know what I'm doing. And I remember again talking to Brian Green, who of a commercial break, and I had a conversation with him, and I was like, man, it's just taking me forever. And he's like, Allison, he's like, the people that want, the people that are expecting a perfectly polished show, they're not your people. Just talk, just be you, just be you. And that was such great advice, and kind of gave me some freedom to release the reins, because I am known to be a little bit of a perfectionist, especially when it comes to my podcast. Not everywhere, but when it comes to my podcast, I really want everything to be exceptional. And overproducing it ends up missing the meat and missing the magic of it. And so, and really the lesson is like, people want to hear your take. They want to hear your perspective. It's like Alex Jones or Sean Hannity, love them or hate them. You're listening because you can get that same news anywhere else, but you want to hear their perspective. You want to hear their crazy take on it. You want to hear like, what the hell? And the rage bait of it all too. And so if that's your thing, Godspeed, go be well with that. But I think it is an important lesson around perspective and identifying like, what does this mean for you, and you talking. One of the lessons that I've learned as well, this is kind of a big lesson that I wish everybody would learn actually, is that, you can't, we spend so much time trying to have a social media post go viral, and you can't, like, even if you go viral on something funny or whatever, but you're trying to build a business, you're not going to build a business off of an algorithm you can't control on a platform you don't own. I mean, I guess you could, but they're fewer and far between. However, our thoughts and our ideas are scattered all across the internet. And that was kind of how I felt before I started the podcast, where I would be commenting and feel like I'm contributing something. I would be posting snarky comments on Facebook or Instagram, or talking to people on that, and thought, I'm expressing myself. But it kind of goes into the void. And it's also, the onus is on whoever the recipient is to put it all together in context, where a podcast puts it all in context for you. Because you can hear people in 3 dimension. You can hear your ideas and the way you think, and the way your beliefs, what you believe, what you don't believe, what your perspectives, what's broken, what needs to be updated. Your point of view is built into something that doesn't have to be so polished. I always say podcasts are always in draft mode. I mean, it's on brand for Reinvention Room, to have my podcast change to 5 different names, but it's always in draft mode. It can always improve. And so kind of releasing the reins on that makes a really uh, big difference. If you are not familiar, there's a podcast called Be There in 5. It's one of my favorite podcasts, and it is run by Kate Kennedy. Kate Kennedy is like the perfect blend of humor. She's so clever. She's so fast. She's so funny. Humor, insightful analysis, and she's got this personal, relatable approach to discussing pop culture, particularly the millennial experience. She wrote a book, it's a best-selling book called One in a Millennial. And what's interesting about Kate Kennedy's podcast, she can talk for hour and a half solo, and they all sound like just stream of consciousness. She's not worried about tripping over her words, but she'll get on these rolls. And I will listen and marvel of like, how the fuck is she doing that? Because in my head, I'm so worried about taking out um, each pause or each moment that in context, it's endearing and she is delightful. And you want to hear her just kind of riff. And she is masterful at it. And so listening to her and having these really long form content and long form episodes, to me, that felt like, wow, this was like a permission slip for me to take the reins off and not be so polished. I mean, I'm looking at the counter now. It says 59 minutes and 10 seconds. I would have loved to have it done sooner, but I'm just going to let it roll and hope that you're going to stick around with it. So I don't know. The style of all of these are really good. I mentioned this before. Downloads don't matter, but relationships do. And a lot of times people are like, and they'll come to me, how do I grow my show? How do I grow my show? Maybe if I advertise or show up here or whatever. And honestly, make a better show. Make a better show. Make a show where you care, not just about sharing what you feel or what you've noticed, but make a show that brings the listener in. And if you've got a business or a personal brand, like what I do is I help triangulate all of those. But you can make them all work together because we are not two-dimensional creatures, right? We are three-dimensional. And you could argue 4, 5, 6, 9D. I've heard all kinds of stuff, but there are a lot of dimensions that make us up. And that's what people are drawn to. I know there are so many people, and even one of my clients, the Coaching Equation. Their podcast is called The Coaching Equation. Ryan Lang and Brooke Bishop. They are freaking awesome, and they have an incredible company called Quantum Empire. And so they help coaches become profitable business owners, predominantly coaches. And so they have like a whole system to help people. And so in their podcast, they every single episode, their promise is that they're always giving you an equation. They're always giving you a framework. That is what you walk away with. And there are so many people that are referred because they have an incredibly loyal, growing group of clients. And they'll say, hey, you need to work with this company. And what they'll do is before they get on like a sales call sales call with them, they'll listen to their podcast and say, yeah, I'm in. I'm in. So make a better show. Make a show that delivers value. Make the show engaging. Open an invitation for interaction in every episode. Maybe that is sending you a very specific DM, or you can use something called SpeakPipe, which is where people can record a voicemail for you, where you can play that voicemail on the show and address it. Like there's so many different ways to make it interactive. Your loyal following becomes kind of your marketing army with you. I know I mentioned celebrities and big names don't grow your show, but great content does. It's kind of like, I think about there are 4 P's to podcasting, and I won't go into it today because we're already over an hour. But maybe I'll do another episode on it if you want. And I've talked about this on social media. But the 4 P's of podcasting to have a great show are purpose. What is the purpose for your show? Is it as a moneymaker? Is it a marketing arm for your business or your brand? Is it a trust builder? Is it a relationship engine? Is it a place for you to express yourself and that's it? There's nothing wrong with any of them, but it's important to have a primary purpose for the show because that kind of sets the stage for it. The second P is person. And the reason why I don't say people is because you want to picture one listener. One listener. Who is that listener? Who is that person? It's kind of like if you're in a room and it's really loud, it's a party, and everything just feels like noise. However, once you hear your name, all of a sudden you turn around, you're being talked to. That's why there is such a critical importance for the person that you're talking to. So the second P is person, is making it specific to them. The third P is premise. What is the premise of your show? What is the perspective that you bring that nobody else brings? And so having the premise of this and like your specific angle, this is where it can get really fun. And I always teach about like, what's your weird? Because people are going to show up because they love your quirks. Or if they don't, great. I want to repel the people that don't really get my vibe. No problem. There are plenty of other shows that are going to be better suited for you. But there are lots of people out there that I would love to meet. And maybe I could help them as well through the show or through the guest or content or whatever it is. There are people out there waiting to find me. And so I need to become found. And part of that is through having a better show and reaching that person, because that person is going to become a super fan. I'll give you an example. I was at a podcast many years ago and I met this woman who is from the US. Okay. And she is obsessed with game shows in the UK game shows. And wouldn't you know, she built a podcast only talking about that because she loved it so much. And was it the biggest podcast in the world? Of course it isn't. But did it have a crazy loyal following that are like super stands for her? Fuck yeah, it did. And that's the beauty of it. Like you can bring all your quirks, you can bring all of your weirdness. Nobody wants a Mel Robbins replica. Nobody wants an Oprah replica. Nobody wants another Glennon Doyle. It's already taken. They want you. So the three: purpose, person, premise. The last one is, what is the promise? What is the promise that your show delivers every time? Meaning, what does your listener walk away with? So for me, every single podcast episode is going to be a conversation starter. It's kind of like, did you hear? Did you hear about, I heard this on Reinvention Room. I got to talk to you about it. Every single episode. It's like the coaching equation. Every podcast episode they have is to deliver an equation, is to deliver a framework. And so something you can walk away with, some takeaway, a tangible takeaway. I always think about it as like a snack. Like when you walk by a pantry and you can grab a snack, you can either eat it, share it, you can pass it on, whatever. That's what you want. You want something that's portable, something that is shareable. So in the promise, like of the commercial break, that comedy podcast is Brian's goal, and his promise is that you're going to laugh out loud every single time, at least once during the show. And not like, oh, that's kind of funny. Like you'll spit soda out of your nose funny, right? So I don't know, like the podcast is for you as much as it is for others. And I just think about when things were so awful and leaving corporate America and leaving everything, my whole life that I had built on safety, security, a paycheck. I mean, all of that is, who knows? I'm sure I would have been caught up in the layoffs that happened afterwards. But all of those things I walked away from and bet on myself. And the podcast is sometimes one of the only things that gives me hope, because I feel like I'm in my element here. I feel like I'm in my element expressing myself and having these meaningful conversations and making these connections and having people apply what they find out here. And have, like, my favorite thing is I've had people have like discussion groups that they formed based on topics that have been discussed on this show. I love being included in that. I love seeing when people tag me or tag their friends saying, you've got to hear this. We were just talking about this. And for me, I feel like the culture changes. Like you may be listening to this right now and thinking, oh, this is good. I hope so. Right. Or you could say, this girl's a bitch. I don't care. Whatever. Either way is fine. But really, the way that culture changes is when you share these episodes, is when you share these ideas, when you start having these conversations in your circles, that's when the actual culture changes. So you can listen and consume it and, synthesize it and, maybe be entertained by it, but it takes on a life of its own when you start to share it. And that, to me has been the biggest gift, to feel like I either had no voice. And when I was in the corporate world towards the end, especially working under a boss that there was no psychological safety. And as somebody that is like somebody that considers myself strong and outspoken, and in those scenarios, I wasn't at all. I was weak and felt small and felt like I didn't have a voice. So to have this podcast, this platform to share, you know, the things that I feel like could make a difference for you. It's been a really incredible journey. And even, it's had its own evolution. Like it's always been about changing the culture. But I also have moved away from so much life coaching content. When I left my corporate job, I started life coaching, lifestyle coaching, and helping people out of burnout, helping people start and launch businesses and consultancies. And I started working with people, but I couldn't quite find my lane. And the reason why I went all in on podcast coaching is because I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't do the life coaching anymore because the presumption, and I feel like podcasts in general, especially in the self-help, whether they're books, podcasts, whatever, all of those self-help kind of stuff, they're all designed to make you feel like you are broken and they have what you need to be fixed. And I believe people who come here, you're not broken. You don't need to be fixed. You have outgrown where you are. And that's why it doesn't feel good all the time. And so, what does growth look like? And that, like moving away from people telling us that we have another syndrome and another pathology. It's like, wait a minute, I didn't know that I had emotional immature parents, but now that I do, fuck. It's like it's almost like inventing stuff that you didn't even think about this morning. And there's some benefit of kind of giving a name to it, but I wanted to kind of withdraw myself out of that game. And so I get tons of pitches all the time of people that are trying to get people out of burnout and whatever. And I just can't do it anymore. And the conversations that I have now are really through the lens of pop culture and using pop culture almost as a reflection for us to reconsider what does it look like to reinvent ourselves, and sharing still culture changing and status quo breaking considerations. But I am never going to talk to you like you are broken and need to be fixed, or that I am some aspirational guru of some sort, because that was never my deal. Y'all are probably laughing. Anyway, like, no, girl, we never thought that. But I think the other cool thing and the lesson about podcasting is that it's so intimate. Your listeners will take them with you. They're going to get in a fight with their spouse and they need to blow off steam, and they put their AirPods in and they, like they go out for a walk, or they're going to take you to the gym with them. Or maybe you're listening to a podcast while you're hiding in the bathroom while your kid's banging on the door, or you're shuttling your kids to their soccer games. And honestly, you're with them when they're taking a shit, like people are listening when you're in the bathroom. It's such an intimate experience to do this work and to have these conversations. And it's kind of fun when you meet people in real life and they're like, I'm so used to hearing your voice. And like, there you are in front of me using your voice. So, like this whole thing has just been just such a gift for me. I'm grateful for it. I don't know why I haven't quit, honestly, with all the ups and downs that I've been, but it's just so much more life-giving. And again, it's so much more expansive. And even though there's a lot of work, there is a lot of work that goes into running a podcast, especially as uh, somebody like me that's a solo creative, a solo creator. And I produce the show myself. There's a lot that goes into it, but it's so life-giving when I hear from you. And it's so life-giving when I have connected with you or when you share it and leave a review or text it to friends or tag me on posts because it meant something to you or it changed something for you. And I am always open. My DMs are always open for ideas, topics, things that you might, maybe people I should know about or things that are running through your head. I think for me, I freaking love cults. I can talk about cults endlessly. And I have a lot of episodes coming up talking about people who have escaped cults and like Christian nationalism. And there's so many really interesting, powerful people that are just changing the game. So I just want to thank you so much for listening to me. If today is your first day here, thank you for listening. And I hope you come back. And if today is not your first time, welcome back. And I'm so grateful. It means the world to me that you are listening. And if you've got a show or an idea for one, but it feels a little wobbly or like it's not doing what you hoped, let's talk. I've opened up my calendar to welcome 3 aspiring podcasters who want to take their influence to the next level. And what I do is I offer clarity calls, and they're for free to help you figure out what your podcast is really for, those 4 Ps, and how to make it work for you, but without trying to sound like everyone else. And if you're interested, you can book a call with me at AllisonHair.com/free call. And if there's a fit, we can talk about what it looks like to work together and make that podcast real. And thank you for listening. And seriously, thank you for being part of this wild ride for over the next 6 years. Over the last 6 years. And I'm excited to see what year 7 brings. But thanks so much for being here. If you liked today's episode, there are several ways to support the show. I produce this show myself, so it helps me continue to make it. First, please rate and review the show on the platform where you listen, and consider sharing this episode with a friend or 5. That's how it grows, by sharing these ideas. Second, please sign up for my email where I send out a short personal note to you every week, and always with a sprinkle of snark and some best finds. You can sign up at AllisonHair.com/email. As always, thanks for listening and hanging out with me in the Reinvention Room.